All right, everyone. Welcome to Coöperism 1213. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome Axel Honneth to our public seminar on cooperation this evening. Professor Honneth is joining us to discuss his ongoing research and forthcoming book on the matter of the democratization of the workplace. The forthcoming book in English, well, the book is appeared in German, Der Arbeiten der Souverän. It is titled in English, The Working Sovereign, Labor and Democratic Citizenship, and we're coming out with Polity Press. And it represents an expansion of his Walter Benjamin lectures delivered at the Center for Social Critique in Berlin in 2021. Professor Axel Honneth joins us from the philosophy department here at Columbia University, where he is the Jack C. Weinstein Professor of Humanities, and fortunately for us, a frequent contributor to the 1313 series. In his forthcoming book, Axel traces the history of the modern concept of labor and its importance to conceptions of self in democratic society. Tracing it from the first articulations in modern political thought, John Locke's second Treatise of Government and his theory of the value of labor, to Adam Smith's analysis of the division of labor, Hegel's thesis on the function of labor for self-consciousness, to Marx's theories about the objectification and alienation of labor, to contemporary feminist theories concerning domestic labor, housework, and care. Building on that historical conversation and evolution, Axel develops a theory of what he calls social labor, or socially necessary, finding it as all performances essential to maintaining those components of social life that are currently taken to be valuable. On that foundational definition that I expect he will develop for us this evening, that serves as a foundation on the one hand for the discussion of different approaches to democratizing labor, on the one hand, democratic alternatives to capitalism, and on the other hand, reforms of the regulation of the division of labor in society. The book builds on Professor Honneth's remarkable edifice from his earlier works on communicative ethics, on recognition politics, and on the idea of socialism. So I'm referring, of course, to his many published works, including The Critique of Power, from 1985, which developed his theory of communicative ethics in conversation with Habermas and Foucault. The Struggle for Recognition from 1992, that developed his theory of recognition, and more recently, his book, The Idea of Socialism, in 2016. So we're privileged to have Axel Honneth prefigure the book in English for us and lay out its principal arguments in conversation with our seminar about the place of cooperation in the workplace. Our seminar focusing primarily on worker cooperatives and other cooperatives throughout every aspect of our lives, housing, consumption, banking, etc. The democratization of labor is one essential dimension, possibly, of a larger theory of cooperation. And Axel Honneth engages many of the themes that we've been discussing in Coöperism 1313 and many of the specific examples and illustrations of cooperation that we've discussed and studied, including, for instance, the worker cooperative that formed the Montauban Cooperative Corporation in the Basque Country, which if I recall, visited, and discussing the book as an important success on the question of labor and sovereignty. So given that the book is still forthcoming, and so we haven't all had the chance to read it yet, or in preparation for the seminar, I've asked Axel to present the work in a slightly more elaborate way than we usually proceed at these public seminars, in order to give everyone a firm grounding of the overarching argument before we open for comments, my comments, and then our seminar discussion. Thank you for joining us, Axel, and thank you all for being here. Let me turn it over to you then, and welcome you all to Coöperism 1213.
Yeah, thank you very much, Honneth, for this invitation. presenting my book when I tried on last Sunday and this morning again to write down something like a short summary of my book. I was imagining taking at least 1.5 hours. So what I'm doing now is even, I mean, I try my best to summarize the book in central parts in half an hour. I have to say I find it enormously difficult. And not only that, I regret so much not to be able to present you more, but this is probably the typical relation of an author to his or her product. Yeah? So let me first give you a very short overview on the content. It has 3 main chapters. The first is called Normative Beginnings, Labor in Democratic Society. The second chapter is Historical Interlude, the reality of social labor, where I reconstruct the development of the organization of work over the last 200 years. And I'm ending up with summarizing certain tendencies within the organization of labor today or under present conditions. And the third part is called the political outlook, the struggle for the future of social labor. Let me first say something about the normative part, because it might not look self-evident to all of you why it seems necessary to give a normative justification for claims of political improvement of working conditions at all. Now, why is it necessary to normatively justify claims for improvement of democratization, of working conditions and all? I mean, I know that there is a certain reservation against so-called Frankfurt attempts to do too much about normative justification. So I give you only one reason for why I think it's necessary to say something about the normative grounds we have in claiming better, more democratic, more cooperative organization of work. The answer is simple, I think, because not only most political philosophers and scientists, but also a large part of the population believes that it is a dictate of economic productivity and efficiency, of the necessary allocation of labor, how working conditions are organized. So I think the prevailing consciousness, be it among philosophers, be it among political scientists or theorists, or be it among most members of the population, is to believe that the organization of work is a necessary outcome of the requirement for productive and efficient production. So I think this is a given. I am not denying that there are groups fighting against the current working conditions, but I think the overall consciousness is different. And I think especially in political philosophy, what I do in the book in a certain part of it is I'm showing that both John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas both take it as a given that the labor conditions have to be organized such that the imperative of productivity is not violated. So they take the labor market as something being, let's say, untouchable. They are not arguing for the existing labor market, but what they are arguing for is that only certain measures against discrimination of the labor market are normatively recommendable, but not interventions in the labor market by, for example, the state. They both agree on that. Yeah. So that is the reason I think it is necessary to give a normative justification for the claim to improve or democratize the existing labor conditions. In order to prove the strength of such a necessary justification, in the first part of my book, I examined 3 classical sources for a critique of contemporary labor relations. I go first into the concept of alienation as created by Marx, obviously, and still prevailing in some areas of the Marxist tradition. I'm going into the idea of autonomy at the workplace as it was created by labor Republicans and is today mainly defended by Elizabeth Anderson, who has talked, given a lecture to our department, I think 2 years ago. And she is a representative of that kind of labor republicanism. And then first you have, third, you have the idea of democratic participation. This is going back to a tradition that I call forgotten because its philosophical legacy is no longer very present in our times. And this tradition claims that it is an obligation of a democratic state to organize working conditions such that all employees are fully capable of participating at democratic revolution. So that's an internal part of what it means to be a democratic society. So this is the normative justification I'm defending. I'm not going into my criticism of the alienation concept, yeah, a relatively sharp criticism of it, and I'm not going into my criticism of the labor republicanism that is also part of Normative. So instead of doing all that, I say some words about this so-called forgotten tradition, which is mainly represented, I think, in my view, by Hegel, Durkheim, and a socialist from England with the name Cole. He has, I think his full name is forgotten. I mean, he's an extremely important figure in the socialist tradition in Great Britain. So when one considers that this tradition almost took the connection between democracy and fair democratic working conditions for granted, it is hard not to be amazed by the extent to which it has been lost sight of today, especially within political philosophy and within political theory. Hegel, Durkheim, and Cole saw the internal link between the two spheres as inherent within the normative content of a certain, namely democratic mode of political sovereignty, one that is not secured exclusively by purely legal entitlements to participate in democratic decision. Instead, fair conditions within the social division of labor are needed to guarantee that every citizen can also, in fact, participate effectively in practices of public deliberation and consensus building. The argument of this tradition for this thesis derived from the observation that the intensification of the division of labor would be so damaging to the cultural and intellectual lives of the working population as to prevent them from making any effective use of their rights to political participation. For this reason, this intellectual tradition insisted that it was nothing less than a duty of democratic states to ensure that labor conditions on their territory were at least sufficient to enable employees to participate without restrictions, or as I'm saying, without shame and anxiety or fear, without restrictions in public processes of democratic decision making. However, none of the authors who subscribe to this line of thought advocated an idea championed among the more radical Marxian influenced wings of the labor movement. None, that is, sought to level out entirely the differences between the political and the economic sphere and to subordinate both to the one principle of democratic majority decisions passed by public assemblies. Such ideas run contrary to the conviction that the tasks peculiar to each of the two subsystems, political democracy here, the worksphere here, were far too different to be subject to the same method of normative regulation. The business of the political sphere, they thought, is the democratic negotiation of legitimate legislation in which all citizens must be involved as equals. By contrast, the business of the sphere of labor is the social coordination of the economic activities of workers who are to contribute in as efficient a manner as possible to the material well-being of the community within an overall division of labor. It was this constraint of economic efficiency, if you want, which prevented the representatives of this tradition from drawing the inference of their more radical counterparts and arguing that the model of direct democracy should simply be carried over to the sphere of the division of labor. That is the reason that in my book I only speak of the democratization of the workplace, not as I speak of it as a process, the end of which we can't determine from our present. So we not even know exactly what it means to have a fully democratized work sphere. What we can envision is a democratization of the work sphere without imagining to be ever in a position to determine the end result or the final end of such a strategy. So this is what I call this viewing the experiment or an experimental process of trying to enlarge democracy within the world. Now, in order to show that the organization of working conditions is relevant to the possibility of democratic participation, I try in my book to identify those aspects or dimensions of the workplace that determine the resources and capacities that determine the extent to which workers are sufficiently equipped for such democratic participation. So I differentiate 5 dimensions within the work sphere that are relevant with regard to the resources and capacities necessary for being able to participate at democratic reformation without, as I said, fear and shame. And I call these 5 dimensions economic, temporal, psychological, social, and intellectual. Let me say something, and hopefully short enough, things about each of these 5 dimensions. The first and foremost condition for participating in public political debates is economic independence. That is, by the way, such a classical idea that one is always surprised to see that it is not respected. Yeah? I mean, even conservative thinkers always believe that one precondition for democratic participation is that you have economic independence. Kant is saying that, everyone is saying that. They very often draw the false consequences from it, but the idea and the principle is very, very obvious. Yeah? Without economic independence, you can't become a democratic citizen because you are always in danger of being dependent on third parties. Yeah? That means it needs a certain economic independence. What that exactly means is a very difficult question, and it's probably definitely not satisfied by the claim of minimal wage, yeah, or by the existence of strong unions which have a certain capacity to negotiate with capital. It needs much more for the establishment of economic independence within the economic sector. But I leave it with that. I go in more details in the book. Any degree of participation, that's the second point, temporal dimension, in the process of democratic reformation, also always presupposes a certain amount of free time outside of work and private life. Becoming a participant in democratic reformation involves a few time-consuming activities. One needs to collect information on particular topics in order to develop reasoned opinions on them. There has to be a discursive processing of this information in dialogue with others. That's a point very nicely developed by Elizabeth Anderson in a paper on democratic participation. So there has to be a discursive process, and you have to have sufficient time to be engaged in such communicative activities of discussion on political matters. Without that, the whole idea of democracy is somewhat meaningless. Yeah? It loses its participatory aspect. So, and it needs participation in a political demonstration or active membership in a political association. How much time someone has at their disposal for these activities obviously depends on how much time is taken up by their work and private life. More time being taken up by work means less time for the various activities that constitute the democratic public sphere, which means that there has to be a strict limitation on work time. What exactly the limitation has, where the limitation has to be, depends a lot on not only on political and cultural circumstances, but mainly on the type of work you have to carry out. Yeah? The more strenuous, the more intellectually demanding the work is, I think the less the time you have to work. So that's the temporal aspect. Now let's speak about this so-called psychological aspect. In addition to economic independence and time, participation in the democratic public sphere also requires a certain amount of self-respect and self-esteem. Without a firm belief that one's political statements are worthy of being publicly heard, citizens lack the courage to participate in democratic discussion. Taking a public stance on some topic of political significance presupposes a conviction that the expression of one's opinion will be seen by other participants as a meaningful and useful contribution to the discussion. However, the sense that one will be taken to be an accepted and recognized discussion partner does not spontaneously arise in a democratic meeting. To step onto the political stage, one must already have sufficient trust in the public value of one's statements. This epistemic self-confidence has a long prehistory in each life, whose course is determined in no small part by the position someone has in the network of the social division of labor. Someone who receives no social recognition in the workplace, or who is not appreciated as someone with certain socially valuable skills, will not possess the self-esteem that is required to express an opinion in political debate without distress and epistemic self-doubt. This, the basis for the degrees to which activities and achievements are recognized in a society is the social division of labor as a system of evaluation. This system determines how the activities that are necessary for social and material reproduction are tailored and distributed, but it also assigns to each activity a productive value for society by way of social typification. This system is the reason why, for instance, housework and childcare, work that is still mostly done by women, enjoys less importance in the social imaginary than activities in business and public administrations. The latter activities are, in turn, also hierarchically evaluated according to criteria such as the intellectual effort involved, length of training required, or alleged economic yield produced. It is fairly obvious that it will be difficult to develop a strong sense of self-esteem if one's work is assigned a low position in this evaluative hierarchy, which operates at a subliminal level. So this point is about reorganization of our of our of the recognitive system by which we attribute worth to labor. I mean, for a short moment during Corona, it was clear to everyone that certain care work is of highest importance for social reproduction. But that was forgotten immediately after, and care work is as badly organized as it was before. Nobody takes specific consideration of it. Nobody values it specifically, and still some other kinds of labor are much higher evaluated than this type of care work. So what it needs is a re-evaluation of the division of labor, or of the different activities that are carried out. Fourth aspect, So far, we have identified economic independence, free time, and a feeling of self-esteem based on public recognition of one's work as requirements for participation in the process of political will formation. We can now add that one must also have some experience of the practices of democratic interaction. I have already mentioned that in passing, that employees must be able to negotiate their labor contracts so that the design of this contract is not left to those with greater negotiation power, the capitalists or entrepreneurs. But the practices of democratic interaction go beyond negotiation. Participation in negotiation usually takes the form of membership in an organization that represents the collective interests of employees. And this participation may well create a basic trust that one will not be left helplessly exposed to whatever working conditions are decided by management. The participation of membership in union is a clear presupposition, but that's definitely not sufficient. It contributes little to the acquisition of the habits of collective democratic action. Only if employees experience in their day-to-day work that their intentions have some influence over decisions about the how and what of their activities, will they come to the trust in democratic processes and find them meaningful. If employees do not learn that their aims and ideas about their work activities are relevant to the decision taken within their organization, they will not trust in the efficacy of their convictions in the context of the processes of political will formation. The spirit of cooperation that characterizes democratic deliberation therefore needs to be fostered in the workplace. It is not realistic to expect citizens to engage in dialogue and display an attitude of mutual respect in a political context if in the workplace they merely take orders. Fifth dimension, the so-called intellectual dimension. Finally, another factor that influences the ability to participate in democratic processes is the volume and mental strain of work. This topic was a major concern of those social philosophy inclined thinkers who developed the classic accounts of the division of labor, and it continued to be discussed in certain schools of thought even later. At the beginning of the industrial age, Smith, Hegel, and Durkheim were already speculating about a connection between the increasing mechanization of work and decreasing social participation. As Hegel succinctly put it, the increasing, and I quote, specialization and limitation of particular work leads to a worrying inability to feel and enjoy the wider freedoms and particularly the spiritual advantages of civil society. End of quote. More recently, a number of psychological and sociological studies have provided clear evidence that this idea was not far-fetched. The more monotonous, intellectually unchallenging, and repetitive the work, the more limited the ability of the workers to take the initiative and change their circumstances and social environment. This is not to say, of course, that employees doing monotonous and simple work are less intelligent or knowledgeable than those doing more complex work. The point is just that the content and volume of their work means that they must endure a significant reduction in autonomous creativity, motivation to demonstrate their inventiveness, and the ability to experience their own efficacy. The principle that all members of a society should, if possible, have an opportunity to participate in the processes of democratic will formation, therefore also demands interventions in the form and division of work activity. If these activities are structured in such a way that the work is overly monotonous, repetitive, and unstimulating, the workers will find it much harder to make use of their right to actively participate in deliberation in the democratic public sphere. So I have identified 5 dimensions with regard to which the workplace is of enormous importance for the ability, capacity, and resources to actively participate in democratic revolution. And I will not summarize it here because time is running like hell. So the next step, very difficult step, I must say, I thought, is to identify and define what I mean with work. Because that seems obvious, yeah? So what should count as work in a society? The problem is that we have enormously enlarged our understanding of work in the last 300-400 years. In the beginning, if you think of Locke, think of Hegel, think of Marx, labor, genuine labor was identified with the fabrication of an object, which means labor was carried out between human subject and nature. And labor consisted in the production of something. Hegel then believed this product has even the advantage that the worker can recognize him or herself in the product as having specific capacity. That was taken over by Marx in his concept of alienation. So alienated labor is wage labor that disenables workers to make that experience because the product is not longer their own. But still, the concept of work, which was prevalent here over a long time, was simply that of fabrication of a product. Then it became slowly enlarged, and what was included was administrative work. That is happening in the 19th century, which is, by the way, absurd. Now, I always like to mention it, because the majority of all people working in the 19th century, even in the so-called industrial country, England, were busy in service work and in agriculture. The people working in industry was a minority, very, not even 20%. So the vast majority of people, even today, are working not in industry, are working either in service work, care, or whatever, teaching, education, care work in hospitals, or in administration, not in industry. Industry was only for 20 years the leading occupation in our so-called industrialized society. So one has simply to enlarge the understanding of work in order to pay tribute to what is really done in a society to maintain its cultural form. So I include in the notion of work both care activities, for sure, I mean care work, yeah, in all respects, and administrative work, which means I am abandoning, when I define work, first the distinction between productive and unproductive activity, which I think is not defensible. Yeah? It is an old tradition to differentiate between productive and unproductive activities. I think it's nonsense and it can't be defended. I abandon the connection between the concept of genuine labor and processes of creating a product, and I abandon the market's role as the sole criterion of socially necessary labor. Also, that is classical preoccupation. You think socially necessary is only that labor that is recruited by the labor market. And then it is obvious that housework doesn't count as labor, yeah, because it's not recruited over the labor market. So I think all these classical definitions of what socially necessary work is are completely misleading. And I come up with a new proposal for how to define work, where the difficulty is now, I only mentioned the difficulty because, again, I have only almost 5 minutes left. The difficulty is then if you enlarge the concept of work, you still have to differentiate it from work or laboring activities that are carried out only with private income. And that is, for example, gardening, private gardening. Yeah, that is collecting venile records. that is playing the piano at home for your own amusement. This is an activity. It is also labor, yeah, because it needs a certain achievement, it needs a certain training, but I don't count it as social labor. So my attempt was to define social labor. So you have to make a distinction between laboring activities done solely out of private reasons and labor activities done for social purposes. And social labor is that kind of labor of we as members of a society think that they have to be regulated, or that the state has to take care of it, or that we have to take care of it. Whereas private activities are not of interest for the public. You know? Interest for the public are what can count as social necessary work. And that is a lot. Yeah, it is housework, it is all care work, it is all administrative work, it is fabrication for sure. But the notion of labor becomes much more enlarged than it was in this tradition, in this traditional thinking. Now, the next step is then the historical account idea. And that in that historical account, I end with a summary on new trends in work organization figure. Maybe I finish with that and I can shortly summarize these 4 trends I see. So if we observe, I mean, I start with an observation from the 19th century, how work was organized there. Then I go over to how work was organized in all work, yeah, not only industrial work. It was organized from the beginning of the 20th century to our times, and then I jump into our present and I observe how work is organized today. And I think one can identify 4 general developments in the physical character, organization, and form of employment. And I very shortly summarize these 4 tendencies. Overall, the social division of labor seems to be creating increasingly isolating working conditions. I think that's the biggest trend. There is less of a need for direct communication with those who do the same or related jobs, and workers increasingly have to rely on themselves. This tendency towards fragmentation, isolation of work has been accelerated by digitalization and individualized control and performance evaluation. Another factor may be the ascendant cultural ideology of individual responsibility and self-optimization, as it was created by neoliberal capitalism. Yeah? The new idea is you have to optimize yourself, which means the individual work, and you have to be individually responsible. So all these trends, yeah, digitalization, more individual forms of control, almost digital control of individual achievement, not longer collective achievement. All that contributes to what I call the fragmentation and isolation of work. And that is, I think, a predominant trend in the organization of work, at least in Western capitalist neoliberal countries. The next trend, second trend is one can secondly observe a shift from manual labor to activities that require a higher level of analytical skill, formal knowledge, and mental ability. A development that is often referred to as the dematerialization of socially necessary labor or disembodied labor. The jobs that are necessary to maintain all aspects of social life that are generally considered valuable are increasingly purely intellectual in character. One might speak of a silent transition from hand-eye coordinated work to cognitive symbolic work. I mean, that is not completely true. There is still a huge amount of physical labor. Yeah? I mean, you only have to look around to see many Hispanics working here, constructing buildings. That's classical manual work. But a trend is a shift from what I call hand-eye coordinated work to cognitive symbolic work, sitting at the computer, controlling processes, even in hospitals that plays in the meantime is huge work. So there is this condition, and I will not talk longer about it because there is a third trend. The third trend is the increasing commodification of public services and household services. This process has distinct causes and follows different patterns in each of the two spheres, households and public services. But in both cases, it leads to a similar reconfiguration of social labor with more or less the same results. Services that were previously provided by public institutions controlled by the state or voluntarily carried out in private households are increasingly transformed into work that is procured by capitalist enterprises and sold for the purpose of maximizing profit and consequently subordinated to the goal of increased productivity. The commodification of services results from the process of market deregulation undertaken by states, which I had discussed earlier when describing the neoliberal capitalism. Among the measures that Western countries adopted in the late 1970s and early 1980s to strengthen domestic capital and reduce government debt were wide-ranging privatizations of services that had previously been run by the state. Precisely which services were privatized depended on each state's specific institutional character, but many were handed over to private, often international companies that competed for profit on the free market. This rush to privatize services seemed to have no limits, not least because the public purse was often empty. Public transport, energy firms, prisons, health services, and telecommunications only remained in state hands. Their electorates made it plain that they would not vote for parties pushing privatization. The work done in private households came to be commodified as capitalist firms responded to a situation in which women in employment who had previously done the cooking, cleaning, and the child rearing for free were keen to be relieved of some of their burdens. There was thus a market for services that could be bought in business size these opportunity to make a profit. The past 3 or 4 decades have seen a proliferation of companies offering a variety of goods and services that replace household work with market-based commodities. These two processes of commodification, the public services and household-related services, have the same result. Work that previously came with secure professional prospects and reliable remuneration, or work that one previously did at one's own pace and without external pressure, becomes fragmented into measurable, standardized units and subjected to personal performance management, all with the aim of raising productivity. Thus, in other 2 areas of work are left to the seemingly unavoidable fate of marketization. Finally, there is a 4th trend that is clear, visible, namely the precarization of work. I mean, this is a process going on within neoliberal reconfiguration of capitalism. And what we have learned over the last 4 years is the growing precarity of work that is dissolving the former status of a recognized industrial labor. Yeah? I mean, there is a fragmentation of this security. Robert Castell, this French sociologist, has described that very often, how the former status that was gained via the activities of the workers' movement, the status of a relatively secured industrial worker, is in the meantime completely dissolved because we have many, many forms of abnormal or deregulated forms of labor. And that is increasingly making work to a very precarious thing, so that we now are living in a time where many people, more than you think, have to take on one, two, or more than two jobs in order to survive. And that is a result of the deterioration of work. I didn't say anything about my politics. I will leave it out because we can tell that in the discussion. Okay, I make a difference. I mean, so the last chapter is on the democratic policy of work. And I differentiate between two types of the politics of work. The first is operating outside the traditional labor by trying to enlarge possibilities for workers' cooperation. I mean, for all kinds of the organization of work outside of the labor market, yeah? Which means freeing labor from from being sold on a market. And the best way to do it is by the initiation of workers' cooperation. This is an enormous risky enterprise within an unfriendly environment. And one has to say the capitalist environment is enormously unfriendly. So I think this can be only part of what the democratic politics of work has to be today, not in the long run, but today. So on the one side, it fights for enlargements of possibilities for workers' cooperation. And it does everything to push the state to allow cooperatives to persist over time. So in France, for example, thanks to the socialist government, there is a certain law, you must know that allows cooperatives, not only is giving money to cooperatives to persist over time, but also allows specific regulation of work within the cooperative. So measures like that are enormously important. They are not the only instrument we have today, because the other instrument has to operate within the labor market and fight for improvements of the labor market. That means everything I mentioned before. It means that the unions that they are fighting now are much limited in their activity. They are mainly fighting for political accelerator. Instead, a strong union or strong worker would have to fight for improvements of the labor market with regard to all the 5 dimensions I had mentioned earlier. That means not only increase of salary, definitely, not only fighting for minimal wages that are sufficient to exist without having to take a second job. It also means to reduce labor times. It also means to fight for democracy at the workplace. It also means to fight for re-evaluation, public re-evaluation of work activities, as I mentioned before. And it fifthly means to fight for a reconfiguration of working activities, which means, I think, one enormous task would be to fight against the existing divisions of labor, because they lead to this kind of fragmentation of work tasks that then become enormously repetitive. So I think a reconfiguration of the division of labor is one central goal of a strong worker movement. That is the reason, that's the last thing I'm saying, that have a second excursus in the book on the concept of the division of labor, where I try to show, I hope convincingly, that the normal view that the division of labor is an outcome of certain technological or economic necessities is deeply misleading. The division of labor as it is existing is the result of political struggles over how to configure specific occupations and jobs. So you can start from the hospital. You have an ongoing conflict there. It's a political conflict on how to divide individual jobs. Whether the nurse has more tasks than she traditionally had, or whether the doctor has reduced tasks, so limiting his her kind of activities so that the care personnel has more tasks. So this is not decided and not determined by any technological or economic requirement. It is open up to the public to reconfigure the division of labor. And I think this is enormously important to keep in mind because the traditional argument which you hear from all sides today is no, the existing division of labor is necessary because it is determined by the technological requirements of capitalist productivity. And I think this is needed.
Thank you so much, Axel. Thank you so much for trying to synthesize a remarkable book. As you know, I am very attracted to these ideas, which is why we're talking about them in the context of cooperation. And so I think what I'd like to propose is a bit of a reframing, perhaps, because we really are so closely aligned on so many dimensions, but a slight reframing of the problematic in a way that I think ultimately leads to slightly different way of framing the political vision. And of course, the political vision here is very, well, it's very pragmatist in including both alternatives, democratic alternatives and worker cooperatives and reforms to capitalist labor structures. And I think that with some reframing that I'm going to propose, it's also replacing at least the democratic alternatives and the worker cooperatives within a larger framework of other forms of democratic self-determination. So the point of departure, I think, for this reframing would be to question the starting point of your work, which is, I think, this remarkable insight that basically labor wasn't valued before modern political. And you make a good point of that. I mean, the starting point really is that prior to Locke and Locke, exactly, and the labor theory of value, there wasn't a valuation of labor in the way that there is now and in the way of the tradition that followed. And so my first question really is whether that takes sufficient account, or whether your analysis or that starting point takes sufficient account of the fact that the valuing of labor was itself a motivated intervention. In other words, the fact that labor became an object of value, whether in the work of Locke or the Protestant work, Protestant ethic, or Hegel or Marx, etc., whether that fact that labor becomes an object of value was driven and inspired by a deliberate, perhaps not fully articulated, perhaps not fully conscious, but a deliberate effort to make work appear valuable to laborers. Now, I might use the word underhanded here in order not to trigger all of the associations that one would put with ideological, but I think you understand that what I'm trying to point to, but namely to the instrumental dimension of the discourse over labor. So the idea here would be that labor was shaped, transformed into a valuable performance in these philosophical interventions. Interestingly and somewhat puzzlingly, perhaps, Marx continued this instrumentalization of labor. And so if we focus on this instrumentalization, I have this sense that the historical analysis of labor in modern political theory takes, well, that your historical analysis maybe takes at face value the ways in which labor was valued as a way to achieve autonomy or self-determination, or through certain processes of objectification, as Hegel describes them, right? The idea that the work product is an externalization and realization of one's being, and thus produces a consciousness of self. But these philosophical theories, well, they may have been, in a way, misleading or illusions or fabricated ways of trying to convince people of the importance of their work as a way to reproduce workers. And as your analysis and as your historical analysis shows well, of course, the history is even more damning in a certain way, especially when one looks at the way at which industrial labor was valued and feminine work, care, and home services weren't. And so there are troubling class dimensions, of course, also gender and race dimensions to the way in which labor was being conceptualized, turned into a valuable performance. Now, if we focus on that aspect, then the question that arises, at least to me, the question is, what work are those philosophical discourses doing? And why would it be important to ask the question of what work those philosophical interventions were doing? I think the first possible response is that it raises a fundamental question about the value of labor itself. Could it be that labor is not, in fact, that which gives us our sense of self, of self-consciousness, of identity, of well-being, of respect? Could it all have been an illusion or an attempt to convince us of this? Could it be that labor is not, in fact, our essence in the notion of kind of the essence of mankind, and that it doesn't contribute so importantly or primarily to our self-realization? So here I would draw on Foucault's critique in his lectures on the punitive society, where he argues that there's really no reason to believe that labor is the essence of man. This is a lecture from March 28th, 1973. And he's criticizing a certain reading of Marx, according to which labor is the essence of mankind. He doesn't specifically refer to any text, but I think we could imagine that he was pointing to the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, where Marx defines the specificity of man by contrast to animals, as his ability to supply freely granted and productive labor, and these notions of, how the animal becomes human and the human becomes animal in this context. He suggests there, though, that this idea, that Marx's idea, that labor is the essence, is an illusion, or more accurately, a construction, his theoretical framework, a construction of knowledge power. It may well not be the case that labor is so valuable as it makes out to be. And he says in his lectures in the Punitive Society, he says, it's false to say, with certain famous post-Hegelians, of course, Marx, that labor is man's concrete existence. The time and life of man are not labor by nature. They are pleasure, discontinuity, festivity. We call them fete, is what he refers to. Rest, need, moments, chance, violence, and so on. And he continues, now it is all this explosive energy that needs to be transformed into a continuous labor power, continually offered on the market. Life must be synthesized into labor power. The clever ploy, he says, and he had actually written the stroke of genius of industrial society, was to take up the old technique of the confinement of the poor, which in the classical age was a way of fixing and at the same time suppressing those who through idleness, vagabondage, or revolt had escaped all the geographical fixations in which the exercise of sovereignty was carried out. So we might ask with Foucault, how much regulation of vagabondage, of loitering, of how much enclosure how much the Black Acts in England and other restraints on movement and work, how much those were necessary to create value in labor. So, of course, he builds on this. This is actually a train of thought that he builds through his successive lectures, starting right after the La Société Punitive in Truth and Juridical Form. He goes to Rio in May. He develops this there in Rio, where he says, what I'd like to show in that series of lectures is that in point of fact, labor is absolutely not man's concrete essence or man's existence in its concrete form. It needs the operation or synthesis carried out by a political power for man's essence to appear as being labor. He refers to this as the infra power, actually, of course, trying to signal the notion of infrastructure with Marx, right? That work, that infra power is necessary to create it. And he continues in the psychiatric power lectures in November the following year, the next year, trying to figure out exactly how these disciplinary processes, techniques bring about, he says, how they bring about the maximum possible use of individuals, and so on. Now, what he's trying to show there, I take it, is that it takes an enormous amount of work, of discursive work, to convince people of the productive idea that labor is valuable. He summarizes that in this basic idea that capitalism, in fact, does not simply encounter labor power just like that. It produces it. Now, so the first thing would be, well, if we started to ask the question, what work do all these philosophies of labor produce? The first point might be actually maybe they are contributing in a way to making us believe of the centrality or the privilege or the primacy of labor in our conceptions of self. Another thing that they help us point out to is the way in which the valuing of labor is often an effort to moralize, often an effort to criminalize the laboring class. And so here, similarly, in those lectures, in the punitive society lectures, he tries to find these texts where labor, idleness is turned into immorality, right? Idleness is turned into immorality, and the working people are turned into immoral actors for being idle, which is effectively stealing the property of their employers. He has these marvelous passages, whether it's from Colquhoun in London or others. There's this marvelous passage where he finds some 19th century texts during the Napoleonic era that's talking about the popular classes as this bastardized race. He writes, this is the text he's analyzing from the 19th century. Their hard souls, dry, fierce, devoid of moral ideals, will only obey their gross sensations. Laziness, immorality, greed, envy will prove the irreconcilable enemies of wisdom and labor, right? Of the economy and of property. So there's a whole dimension, a strong dimension of the way in which work becomes moralized, in part as a way to control workers and to discipline them and to produce workers. Of course, all of this ultimately feeds into the famous passages in Discipline and Punish in 1975, where Foucault basically argues that the accumulation of capital, so basically Marxist thought, right, has to go hand in hand with this notion of the accumulation of bodies, right, which is his interventions. His book, which is a political economy of the body, and in a way, a political economy of labor, of disciplining or of creation of labor, needs to go hand in hand with Marx and the accumulation of capital. I mean, he says it very specifically. This is, you know, he cites to Marx, and then he said the two processes, right? This is from Discipline and Punish, the accumulation of men and the accumulation of capital cannot be separated. The technological mutations of the apparatus of production, the division of labor, and the elaboration of disciplinary processes sustained a set of very close relations. So the key here is that when one highlights the work that the concept of labor does, we kind of ask ourselves a different set of questions about the concept of labor, which is not so much the history of the concept of labor, which is fascinating and important and essential to defining labor properly, but rather some effort to identify and understand in the present the work that labor is doing, namely the work that theories of labor are doing. Now, so third, if all of this is true or partly so, then it leads me to wonder whether labor should have a privileged place in relationship to your theories of democratization. In other words, is the goal of democratizing labor, which I share entirely, something that should be thought of as unique or privileged, or as just one form among others regarding the need to democratize our social life? Now, this shouldn't undermine the importance of your argument. I think it slightly reframes it. It doesn't lessen the practical imperative that's at the heart of your work to democratize labor, but it reframes it. It means that the democratization of the workplace is one, among other dimensions, of the need to democratize every aspect of our lives, from our family life to our residential life, where and how we live in terms of our living conditions, to consumption, to food cooperatives, to how we bank, finance, insurance, etc. This would mean that we come to the problem from a slightly different angle or from a slightly different perspective, not from the angle of labor primarily or only, but from the angle of an equal and cooperative democracy. The need to democratize labor then runs parallel to the need to democratize the family, to the need to democratize our living arrangements and our housing, the need to democratize our consumption, food, finance, etc. And that doesn't derive so much from the history of the concept of labor. It comes from somewhere else, perhaps a political theory of cooperation. So it means that we would come to the questions and to our similar responses on the basis of the values of democratic self-determination in equal terms, and questions of sustainability in every aspect of our lives. And I think these are the same values that we share and that you develop in your book. But my amendment then would be that those values need to guide every aspect of our lives and thereby constitute a regime or a network of cooperation, which would mean that I would want then to, I would want the title of the book to not be the working sovereign or working democracy, but I would argue for something like the cooperative sovereign or cooperation democracy, in order to infuse democratic self-governance in every aspect of our lives. Of course, not just politics, that's the move you make, not just politics, but work, but not just work, but social relations, housing, consumption, production, etc. To give everyone an equal voice and equal share in the resources produced and in the social arrangements, to provide through equal participation for the welfare of all of the stakeholders and because so many of these cooperative initiatives are at the local level to promote care of the environment and sustainability. So it's in this context that what I would suggest is that the practical emphasis ultimately at the end then politically would be more on worker cooperatives in your context as the most fully functional form of democratic labor with self-determination, equal voice, and sustainability. This wouldn't undermine the efforts to unionize in the capitalist or cooperative working environment, actually, and to also transform the working environment while we engage in forms of cooperation. But it does in some way privilege or highlight the importance of cooperatives across the board: worker, housing, consumer, producer, retail, etc. And it would mean that the argument would come out a little bit more from the cooperative tradition, from the 19th century cooperative tradition, in relationship, of course, to the discourse on labor, but emphasizing a little bit more of that tradition itself. It's a slightly different highlight, I think, that also, in a way, privileges a little bit more the concrete utopia, which is part of your book, a little bit more over some of the more kind of realist solutions. Okay. So a possible reframing, maybe, starting from this questioning, really, about the value of labor.
So I'm allowed to.
Yes.
This one. Yeah. Yeah, that was extremely interesting. I think to a certain degree, I agree with what you said at the end, but with a certain different emphasis, and I will come to that. So let's start with, I think, your central point. Your central point is, let's say, a Nietzschean, Foucauldian direction. And I find that interesting. It doesn't convince me, but it is a relevant topic. Yeah? So I think the question is simply, I mean, to bring it down to a simple question: how do we explain historically, or in terms of intellectual history, the growing evaluation of work since roughly 1700? Yeah, I mean, not very important there. We exactly put the point of transition. It was clear that in earlier, Catholic countries, but also in completely different countries, work was not appreciated as a very relevant human activity. Other activities were much more highly evaluated, and work was seen as a kind of natural necessity. I mean, we have to work, but there is nothing of importance for our form of life. So how to explain the slow transition from such deep evaluation of work to rise in the evaluation of work? And you're giving a very interesting Freudian Nietzschean account. And I would like to give a counter, which is only alluded to in the book. So it's not that we have only certain transitions in intellectual history. So we have with the Protestant ethics, which is only relevant, I have to say, for a certain part in Europe. Yeah, we have a new evaluation of work out of religious concerns. That is of a certain importance, but it shouldn't be overestimated. Yeah, I think Weber overestimated the relevance of the Protestant ethics for the slow re-evaluation of work within at least Western culture. I leave with the question how that translates into other cultures, and only speaking now about the Western culture. I think in other enormously important process next to the re-evaluation of work or evaluation of work in philosophical texts like Locke, Smith, Hegel, Marx, whomever you take. I think this specific emphasis on work is a result of another political process, namely the revolt of the bourgeoisie against nobility. I think that is the central principle. Because in the moment in which you attack nobility for taking political authority only on the basis of property and blood, you have to imply that the basis for political authority from now on is work. Yeah, and I think this is the almost self-evident consequence or implication of the bourgeois revolution against aristocracy and of the revolutions we have seen then from more or less from the 17th century onwards. Locke is the first probably to make that point. I mean, he is obsessed with property, but he makes the point that property based on labor is one central justification for having political authority. So in the moment you have to think everything immediately, because what you have then to imply is that a political community is not longer based on authority either from God or from blood, but on being willing to cooperate with others in the narrow sense of labor. They are not in your broader sense. Yeah? So, and I think this is the starting point for the leftist position to point out that this has enormous implication with regard to how labor has to be organized. Because then you could say, you are allowed to say, look, when you think that the justification for your inclusion in political will formation is labor, then first you have everyone to include in political authority who is willing in doing work. And secondly, then you have to organize labor such that it allows people to be part of the political sovereignty. So these are, I think, the theoretical steps. This is very abstract. In fact, there were a lot of debates, struggles between different intellectuals about and different participants in actual conflicts. But I think the labor movement is in that sense a very late product of the bourgeois revolution, yeah? In the sense that it starts from the premise of the bourgeois revolution, and that work is probably the foundation for political participation, for being authorized to determine the general will, this also. But the workers' movement drew another conclusion from it, and a more radical conclusion. So it radicalized the bourgeois revolution. That would be my counter. Yeah. I mean, I think Foucault and Nietzsche is not probably doing the same thing with regard to work, but I think it sounds a lot. Yeah. So I think there is something in it. Yeah. It's not so that this Foucauldian Nietzschean point is not relevant. I think there was a certain tendency to start to praise a certain type of labor with the either intentional or not intended purpose to make it attractive to people who were used to other life. Yeah? This is what E.P. Thompson described as a traditional work ethics. The traditional work ethics was you only work as so much as it's needed for your own survival. That's a traditional work. And it needed a transition of this work ethic to a more productive one. And I think that Foucault's arguments may play a role with regard to the explanation of this, that's not Protestant work ethic, but capitalism. yeah, work as much as you can do in order, because that is the purpose of it. I mean, that this specific idea may be a result of something that Foucault wanted to do. I agree with it. So I think I leave out the question of the moralization of work. I think there is something in it. Yeah, I think it has to do a lot with what I tried to do in my excursus, namely why specific forms of labor were taken as being of importance and others not. That had to do with a certain moralization of work. Yeah, there was always the concept of dirty work. There was always the anxiety of a rebellious working class doing physical work. Yeah, that was important because doing physical work also meant in the imaginary of the bourgeoisie that they are stronger than you. So you need a lot of military forces to oppress the working class, because the working class is the class doing physical work. They have physical work, so you need military. So I think that played a huge role in history and in intellectual debates between bourgeois thinkers and more thinkers more leaning to the working class or belong to the workers' movement. But I don't want to go into that. I want to come to the last point because that seems to me important. I think I am in deep sympathy with the idea, to say with the idea, sorry, with the idea to not to think about democratization, not only in terms of, but instead to think of democratization as something that has to be, that, that, that has to be take place in all stations of the society, starting from family and ending probably with having more respectful forms of dying, yeah, more democratic forms of dying. I can imagine more democratic forms of dying than those we have today. But I think, and this is what I'm probably thinking differently. I think we as a public have only two instruments available to influence the democratic attitudes of the population. And that are schools and working. Only these two, because we don't have easily access to how family organize their private life. Yeah. I mean, we can regulate it, we can put the pressure on families to be more democratic. But I think the organized public, if I can speak like you, yeah? The organized public has only two means that allows to self-influence society. I mean, to influence the influence society and to influence, let's say, habits within the population. And I think the most important are schools, even more important than working conditions, because school is the first experience every person is going through. Yeah. So the more democratized schools are, the better for democratic life. That was Dewey's point. But the second instrument the state or the organized public has is how it organizes its own labor conditions. That is hardly available to the organized public when it is willing to break the interest of capital. Then it has the labor conditions as an instrument to self-influence democracy. The other things are wonderful, but they are not usually to be organized. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The more cooperatives we have, the better. But what can we do as an organized public to influence our own societal life? There, I believe, in different things we have to make. All the others, I mean, we have the law. The law is important. you can use the law for influencing, we are doing it, using law for the reconfiguration of families, yeah, for citizenship. And so we can forbid parents to hit their children. We have forbidden rape in marriages. So we can do a lot, but we can't simply use them for for self for the self manipulation of our children. Yeah. So therefore, I think that schools and labor.
Okay. Fascinating. Fascinating. We're getting closer, I think. Yes. Good. Not all the way, but we're getting closer. I have a lot of thoughts in response, but I don't want to monopolize and I want to open up. And I know that maybe, I don't know, Katharina, you were interpolated on the way I think in which law can be used in these ways, I think, possibly. I don't know if you want to jump in now or yes? Yeah.
I'm crashing the party too, because but I'm not sure I want to comment directly on the role of law as an instrument to influence society. I think my view is a bit more complex. That of course law is critical, but it's not only used by the public, but it's deeply used by the private actors to influence life. But the bigger point I want to make, I was thinking all the time about money and the monetization of social relations. Because I think the property rights relations with nobility and feudalism are fundamentally different from the property rights of the bourgeoisie. It's about the monetization of everything. And I think the change, in my view, the change in the labor relations is part of the monetization of basically trying to extract the pecuniary value of everything. So property becomes alienable. That's a huge thing. Labor, people are landless, and I was just wondering whether, where the development of money systems and credit systems and debt in the form that it takes under capitalism comes in this idea of the the long durée of maybe labor relations and labor to capital, but more generally of these capitalist societies, and also as a source of undermining quite fundamentally the idea of democracy and also of cooperatism, because I think the dependencies that are created through debt relations, or the way in which we have created money and franchise money relations to private banks, I think cuts really deeply into the organization of capitalist societies. And I'm not sure this is fully captured if we focus on labor alone, or even sort of go to a full theory of corporatism. I think we talked about this before, Bernard, when you launched your book at the law school. I think the way we fund, the way society decides to fund or not to fund certain types of social activities is quite important, I think.
For a moment, and then I'm going to collect a few questions.
Yeah, I mean, probably I have a little tonight view. Yeah? I thought, I think your idea is that the monetarization is a result of processes that enables private actors to become law given. So that's a process I really can't judge about because I'm not sufficiently familiar. To what degree, but to make your point, that point in your book, I mean, to what degree private actors, and that means primarily corporate, are able in the meantime, and this seems to be very reasonable, to create their own spheres of law, their own law worlds. so that the state is more and more coming in competition with individual actors like diplomatic. And so, I mean, with regard to the working conditions, I think the question is the increasing dependence on debt, is it a result, as I would not include it, is it a result of the precarization that was probably initiated, that was already a piece of work, but the increasement of precarization was initiated by the transition from organized capitalism to neoliberalism. And I thought that this change, transition, increased enormously the dependence of many people in the world sphere on them, which makes probably the whole idea of dependency on debt and financial debt much more important for the reorganization of work here than of such. And I agree to that. And it's not a point in my that we
Okay, good. We're going to collect 3 questions now. Starting over here, if you can présenter votre nom, s'il vous plaît. And then Nikita, and then Rayan.
Hi, so one quick question for me. I'm convinced about work as an important source of social esteem, but in a society where increasingly work is precarious and we may not have the quantity of work required for that source of social esteem, do we need to think about other sources of social esteem outside work, and what could they be? And this is the debate between, a universal basic income that doesn't give you that source of social esteem versus a universal participatory income that would give you that source of social esteem. But if it's not real and if it's created artificially, what are the other forms of social esteem that we can think of?
Okay, thank you. And then Nikita.
I've been thinking about unorganized working force and unorganized workers and the unorganized labor sector. So, of course, we have the organized workers, but I'm just thinking about how when we're talking about labor as being the essence of a person and whether that is true or not, there are a couple of thoughts that come to my mind, and I'm just asking. So if we're saying that every person should have a right to work, we're also saying that a person should also have the right to not work. Is that correct? And the other, I mean, of course, when we look at the idea of the black codes and what they did, and the other, I was just thinking about how labor organizing in some way has created so much of a ripple effect in organizing societies and changing societies. And at the same time, they've been incredibly limited and limiting in their own aspects. So even if we were to think about cooperative frameworks where we organize around different forms of access of social, political, economic life, how do we in some way integrate them if not through the lens of labor? It's just something that I'm struggling with up here.
Rayan, did you want to ask a question? Excuse me? You're still working on it. Okay, sorry. All right, well, then we'll take one more here.
Hi, I'm Martin. My question is, it's coming. Just like, do you have an idea or examples of like at the end enterprise level, like organizational level, what form of organization would be able to redistribute self-esteem in a more fair way? And do you think that it's compatible with large-scale corporations at all?
Yeah, easy questions. I jump in them, into them. Yeah, Valerie and me, we had already discussion on the sources of social esteem, which is an extremely interesting question. Yeah, it relates to your question too. So I think in principle, I hope I'm not making a mistake. In principle, there might be today 4 sources of social esteem. The first definitely is having a legal status, yeah, which means being a legally recognized member in a legal community, which means normally in a democratic state. So that is not available to a lot of people and to a growing number of people, for example, to refugees, yeah, but it should count as a source of social esteem, right? And a very legitimate source of social esteem. So the right to not to have rights is, in that sense, the absence of a minimal source of social esteem. The second source is traditional, also membership in small groups of shared activity. Yeah, this I think is what John Rawls has in mind when he speaks about the social sources of esteem. He thinks of small groups. He thinks that when I'm a member of a choir, that is sufficient for giving me esteem for a specific talent I have, something to say. So if I'm a member in the soccer team, that is a source for social esteem, really. Yeah? So when I'm a member in a religious community, again, that's a source of social esteem. Everyone being a member of that community is esteeming me for being religiously interested, and so on and so on. So these are small groups that can count as sources for social esteem. The traditional source for social esteem was conceived of as being socially recognizable. Yeah, that is different to the second sense, because this is something that has validity within the whole national or non-longer national community. Yeah, I mean, if you think of small groups, that gives you esteem, but this esteem does not have any kind of variation outside your own little group. Whereas the esteem that was supposed to come from your laboring was seen as being more general and therefore more important. Now, the question today is whether we can still conceive of labor as a source for that kind of social esteem. And that is an enormously important question. My position on this is clear because I pointed it out. I think it should. It should be a source of social esteem, which then requires for us to reorganize labor conditions such that each position in that division of labor can count as a source for social esteem. That is an enormously difficult task, and I'm not thinking that this can be simply done by device of any kind of state. Yeah, the state is not capable of simply, let's say, ordering the population to re-esteem work that was not yet esteemed before. Yeah, this is not a thing of, let's say, an authority by the state. It is, if at all, a process of cultural learning, cultural re-evaluation, cultural re-education, and it has to go hand in hand It's a reorganization of the workplace, which means you can do everything you want. You can initiate a cultural revolution that is supposed to esteem the work of nurses much higher. It will not be successful if you don't reorganize the work. If you make it higher in salary, if you give nurses higher authority, if the whole working conditions of nurses is not changed. So the increasement of social esteem has to go hand in hand with the reorganization. But people today think, and this is the fourth source I have in mind, and we was shortly mentioned. I think there is a growing number of social theorists and probably even political philosophers who believe that because labor is more and more experienced only instrumentally, is not seen any longer as a source for esteem, and because labor is more and more fragmented and is more and more deorganized, it can't count any longer as a source of social esteem. So the counter program to this idea is the idea of an unconditional minimal basic need. Yeah. So I think I don't know whether those who defend the idea of the universal basic need are really believing that such income, which is unconditional, can be a source of social esteem, can be a source of social esteem. I don't believe that again. I think, and I'm writing in my book, we recite a critique of the program of the unconditional basic income. Because I think that basic income is privatizing people even more than they are privatized already. So basic income is a very dangerous idea because it distorts society even more into private clients of monetary reward. But that is a very open discussion. I think it's going on there, whether it would not be much more recommendable to think of strategies of universal basic income in order to solve the problem we have with regard to the works. We have a lot of problems. It's at the moment not unemployment. That seems not to be, at least in Western capitalist countries, the main problem. I think it's simply the degree of precarity with it, which is the real thing. And so the people who believe that would be better solved by basic income solutions might be have a good point in that. I don't think that it can serve as a source for social esteem, and I don't think it can serve, that was the other question, as a source for social integration. That's also good. What are this is not a debate about the sources of social esteem, but the sources of social integration. And I always said, and this is with Hegel and others, Marx, that legal inclusion is never sufficient. It is one source of social integration, but cannot be the sole source of social integration. Classical idea, which I simply take over, is that it is labor. Yeah, I mean, the division of labor as worker has been the central source for social integration. And we call it organic solidarity. Yeah? That's the source for creating organic solidarity. I don't see other source, and probably not sufficiently equipped with social fantasy. I mean, there should be other sources for social integration. I mean, nation building was one, nationalism, but we think we can say this in this audience. We don't want that, yeah, because we have seen and learned by experience in Hannah Arendt how dangerous nationalism is. So, what else can be sources of social integration in my perspective?
Good, good.
Okay. I'm gonna jump back in and also raise your hands, if anyone wants in. Um, just to continue the conversation a bit, and also maybe to push you, Katharina, as well. Because, so what I found interesting in your response, earlier is that, I mean, so a fascinating Nietzschean genealogy of work here through the bourgeoisie, I think, right? But that also instrumentalized labor. I mean, it's a different theory of the instrumentalization of labor in a way, which means that possibly, again, labor doesn't have a paramount value here by contrast to the other items. And adding the school in a Deweyan way, I think, is helpful. Questions of finance and banking become important, but the reason actually I was interpolating you, Katharina, was because of the not a simplistic theory of law, but the theory of kind of legal form that is the basis of your work, the Code of Capital, right, is a theory about the way in which legal regulation can be used, is used as a tool of construction that you talked about in terms of constructing capitalism, but can be used as a tool in the same way to construct Coöperism. I mean, and that's why I draw so much on your work in the book Coöperation. And I mean, if that's true, then we do need to think about the way in which, I mean, the state is present in the same way it is in the regulation of work, right? Which is the basis of your privileging work, how the state would be present in, or to regulate and or to do differently things like even money creation, possibly, right? Some form of decentralized, democratized money creation, which is going on right now. I mean, I don't want to say the infamous word Bitcoin, which it's complicated and has a lot of different ramifications, but forms of decentralization of the production of currency, and possibly or not, I mean, the way in which the digital interventions allow for decentralized pods of creation, would be a space, I think, where we could think about this, where again, you know, the state regulation might have an important role to facilitate this or to regulate it in certain ways, in the same way in which it would be regulating, and in the same way in which it fosters, say, or makes possible worker cooperatives, through, you know, incorporation statutes, et cetera, and tax schemes. But I think we could also think about legal regulation as having an equal role. I mean, it was fascinating that you spoke about sexual assault law, right? Which, so that's, you know, that's what I'm teaching right now. The state plays an enormous role. I mean, it's an imperialist project, the penal law, right? So it's playing that same role in terms of shaping the family through divorce law, through custody law, through child protection, through sexual assault and regulation of sexuality, etc. Same thing for, you know, I would think for food regulation, consumption regulation, etc. So that's where it seems to me that your work, Karina, would enhance or make possible a more copious way of thinking about democratization and self-determination across a lot of these fields of social existence and life. You want to say something about that?
Yes, in theory, yes. I'm, I think about law not only about like a paternalistic top-down governance of society, but very much as a tool of empowerment, right? And so one could imagine the empowerment of different actors and communities in different ways than we currently have, which of course would require a political struggle to get there. But we could also use many of the forms that we currently have to reconstitute part of societies in this more bottom-up fashion, right? So, I think with cooperatives in particular, there are many legal forms in the United States that co-ops can use and do use and to organize themselves. I was pointing to the money issue because I think, I think in my world, in my view, I think law and money are the two critical social resources for organizing capitalist relations. But they would also be important in other forms of social relations in complex societies. So to me, money is also very much a kind of a legal form. And the question how how private actors are empowered or recognized, or how certain forms of money are being sanctioned and others are not sanctioned, are part of that inquiry. So the very fact that Bitcoin, that they could make these advances in creating alternative currencies without the state actually shutting them down, as the state has so often shut down decentralized currencies that communities have created for themselves, is an interesting aspect of those types of relations. So I think I fully agree that the state is always in these relations, but it's also in a relatively indirect fashion, and I would think it's in more relations. I think there are more instruments states could then also mobilize if it wanted to have the political backing to do so, than just through school and education. Of course, the media come to mind, but I think also the allocation and the empowerment to create things of monetary value and to fund organizations that can't fund themselves. So I think to me in the US, the world of co-ops is hindered not so much by the absence of legal form. You don't have to use the old co-op statutes, you can use other things. The real issue is money. How do you fund these things? How do they survive an economic crisis? Where are the resources coming from to ensure that more people can participate in them? That is, I think, a critical issue. And that has a lot to do with the way in which we have organized our money systems and financial systems.
And it has a lot to do with the way in which other forms are privileged in the tax code and et cetera, which you were referring to and you speak about in the book in terms of the difficult milieu in which cooperatives are trying to emerge and engage. Do you want to, I saw you taking some notes.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I have something meaningful to say, but it's not really my area. But I was asking myself whether I would like to insist on the point that the instruments, I mean, law is an instrument by the state. The state can make either better use of that instrument. I think we are relatively in agreement about what it means to make a good use of law by the state. It means empowerment. It means empowerment, probably not only of individuals, but of politics. So the question is it that the state at the moment is not capable of some policy of the collective of individual because it has not sufficient money, but famous of it, the crisis of the welfare. The welfare state is simply in a situation where it has one quarter of money, therefore it is less powerful than it still And therefore, whatever whatever we want the state to do, the state simply is not able to do because it has the instruments but not the financial. That's one part of the question. And the other part is, even when the state would have all the legal and financial resources available, I think if it would intervene in how to allow whether they allow, whether they are money, more, and so on. It's really mean that the state, by its legal instruments and by financial resources, can only directly intervene in social life by access either to food or to the laws of working. I don't see other ways to take it up. But we don't want the state to immediately create new things by authority law. Yeah, we don't want the state to, let's say, to press family members to be more democratic. That would be, I think that would become virtually republic.
But the state has done that, right?
I know.
Was that so there was like a space that was the private space for the paterfamilias until well into late into the 19th century, where you would not punish the husband for beating up the wife or children, and so the state has done some of that. But I think that's not. I mean, I might have just a different idea of what statehood means. In general, I also have a different idea of what money creation means. The state never runs out of resources if it wants them. State can issue as much money as it wants, as long as it creates its own money. If you don't, then you have a bit of a bigger problem. But I think that's part of the myth, as the modern money theory has, I think, correctly pointed out, of the idea that you can constrain the state just by saying it doesn't have the resource. The question is to whom the state delegates the power and backs that power to create more money. It's not a one-time allocation to co-ops. It's the question, I think, of the milieu, of the ecology within which different social economic organizations can survive. And I think within the existing system of financial capitalism that we have, it's almost impossible for co-ops to survive. And I do believe it's less a question of having those statutes available for creating them. You can take a limited liability company statute from Delaware, and you can rewrite it as a co-op statute, and many co-ops are doing that. That's not the problem. I think the problem is whether they have whether there's an ecology of other financial intermediaries that would be both empowered and interested in creating money and lending and investing on very different terms than on cutthroat capitalist terms. And that the state could also influence if it wanted to. Sure, it could do.
Everybody depends,
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah, and so before I pass the mic to Rayon and one last round of questions, I just want to agree and slightly disagree with a few things. I do think that even in terms of incorporation, facilitating co-op incorporation can make things easier, even though we can be creative as attorneys. We had an excellent panel last year on Cooperation Jackson down in Mississippi, which is they have several cooperatives and a land trust, and it's a political movement really of cooperative, self-sustaining, self-determining, somewhat separatist as well, initiative down there. But one of the fascinating things was that Kali Akuno, who is one of the co-founders, was talking about how difficult, how tricky it is in Mississippi because they didn't have a co-op statute because co-ops were viewed as communist, basically.
they do have a co-op incorporation statute for agricultural cooperatives. So they were able to do that easily. But everything else is a question of, playing with the LLC law or figuring out whether you're going to incorporate somewhere else. And so, I mean, there are, this is what, we refer to as transaction costs. There are some elements there that can facilitate or make it much easier. In addition to naturally, tax rates and the fact that there isn't a capital gains rate for cooperative member benefits and things like that, right? So the law really can play an important role in different ways. And on the family, I mean, I think that the point is that there isn't a neutral state. In other words, it is fully regulated, whether it's through, I mean, today it is fully regulated, whether it's questions of no fault divorce or how divorce can happen, inheritance law, child custody, all those things. I mean, and none of it is in any way neutral. And so it's all in the tweaking of it. And in other words, I mean, and so, making it more democratic is the same thing as making it less democratic or leaving it the way it is, in a way. I mean, it's all a decision as to kind of like how we turn the knobs in terms of influencing, which is we do all the time, influencing family relations, influencing sexuality, influencing the way people relate to each other, So, so in a way, it is inevitable and deeply constructed by state regulation. So I feel more sanguine about the possibility of reordering in a way, since that's what we're doing. We are ordering all the time. Every prosecution,
independent. Yeah, and the state is doing that all the time. I completely agree with that.
yeah.
But I don't think the state can intend by legal means to create certain virtues, democratic virtues in the state. I think the state has limited power by its own legal instruments. Yeah, and as I said, it's always regulated, can be completely, but it did it by either forbidding that or forbidding that. I think the idea that the state positively aims at creating certain habits or virtues that can be is for me misleading. That's the difference to public schools. And the reason I'm so heavily against private schools is because public schools are instruments of the, I mean, I don't know exactly how it is being organized in the United States, but at least in most European countries, public schools are organizations by the state. That means the state can, with all instrument affairs, influence the way of teaching, the way schools are.
Definitely, we've seen that in Florida and across the country. It's, for better or for worse. Yeah. Okay, Rayan, you want to pipe in? We're going to have last set of questions and then we'll wrap up with final thoughts.
This isn't like too loud, is it?
Is it working?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Good. Okay. So this is not going to be particularly well formed, but first of all, thank you for condensing all of your ideas in this regard into some.
So talk louder. Sorry, Rayan. Or stand
Okay.
up and talk louder.
So I'm just sort of interested in teasing out some of the empirical implications of what you said about the interruption of democratic will formation for some of the processes that we see in the political sphere around us. It seems to be sort of obvious, and I'm not saying that you've said this in your work at all, but it seems to be sort of obvious that the interruption of democratic will formation doesn't mean that there is no sort of generation of normative values going on in these processes of work that you're describing. And I am. Okay. It seems to me that a couple of the processes that we do see, in as much as the rise of populist politics, or it's not an exhaustive list by any means, as well as sort of collective bargaining and protectionist lobbying, taking more the form of not resisting exploitative forms of work, but also just sort of resisting any replacement by so-called ostensible migrant crises and the people that sort of come in with sort of more globalized borders, which creates some sort of resentment. But we're seeing really the generation of certain values that are completely devoid of the Kantian system of a dignitary individual at the heart of it, at the heart of being a participatory democratic agent. What you describe as a sense of being a genuine member of a group of equals. And I'm just interested in teasing out what might be, you think, the consequences of the rise of this other value system in processes like both anti-intellectualism and mistrust of technocratic governments, which no longer seems to be just based in distrusts of modernist meta-narratives of truth, but in fact of the democratic discourses that seem to generate no goods that can really be recognized by this value system that's completely devoid of that. That makes sense. There's a lot of like buzzwords in there.
Can you formulate just one last time?
Okay. Could we perhaps be seeing?
Can I ask something?
Yes,
You're
please.
always referring, if I understand it correctly, to Kant.
Yes, slightly. Well, I mean, I'm sort of accepting that Kant is sort of at the heart of this dignitary individual that we conceive of at the heart, conceive of in the midst of, conceive of as a democratic agent. So I'm just thinking, if in fact this value generation and will formation is now taking place in a system that does not recognize this dignitary value, is it possible that anti-intellectualism, the mistrust of technocratic governance, a complete sort of faith in populist figures is actually being sort of propped, and the answer to this may well be no, is being sort of propped up by processes that remove the laborer from this sort of meta-narrative. That's kind of it.
Shall I answer immediately?
Why don't we take one more? We're taking one more question from Parker.
Thank you for the talk today. So my question is kind of rooted in my reading of Professor Harcourt's book as well, in that when I read that, I had a concern about what happens when these processes bump up against resistance of like capitalism, in that if we're democratizing the workplace and we are now prioritizing humanity, individuals over growth or profit, does the capital, like the state, start responding to that? And I'm also kind of curious, just in the last 5 minutes of conversation, the kind of pitfalls of democratization and like kind of the roles that play. So I think we've, at least in the United States, we've seen kind of the failures of democracy and how false narratives, media narratives, propaganda can kind of influence the population to make irrational just choices that are bad for them and bad for those around them. And how those failures we're seeing in political democracy might pop up in a workplace democracy. So if those two questions make sense.
Yeah.
Need to address those areas, but also conclude or give us your concluded thoughts.
Whether I'm capable of doing that, I don't know.
Okay, okay.
I can try to answer the two questions. I think I have a slightly different idea about what democracy is about, or democratic reformation is about. Because when you were reformulating, it sounded like, for me at least, an extremely individualistic understanding of democracy. Namely, that democracy is more or less consisting in individual people as self-determining agents are making individual decisions. And this is the opposite to my own understanding of democracy, that it's much more Julian, much more, let's say, communicative or collective, or however you want to define it. Therefore, I think the value of democracy, I mean, democracy has at least probably two values. One is epistemic, yeah, it's probably the best form of coming discursively to good conclusions, because it includes as many voices as possible in the solution finding. And secondly, it has clearly a moral value, namely that enables people to make use of their own capacity for self-determination, but it makes it only possible by forcing people into communicative deliberation. So if I'm a Kantian, I'm a Kantian of the public sphere. Yeah, who is there? Probably it's not really answering your question, but that was it what I could make. Yeah, I'm sorry. The second question, I think we had a discussion. Yeah, I think it would be wrong to claim, as some Marxists did 50 years ago, that a state within the capitalist economy has to be a capitalist state. I think that is deeply false. I mean, I believe the state is state. What is the state? I'm not talking about the state. That's a very complicated thing, but the state as a certain agency, this monopoly on the exercise of power, as Weber would say, or as an agency with sufficient authority to make laws. I mean, these are probably already two different understandings of the state. But I think it is not automatically the case that the state, in all historical circumstances over the last 200 years, played the role of fostering capitalist activity. I don't believe. I think it was too much depending on politics and on what kind of vision was prevailing in the overall majority of the population. So after the Second World War, the state in most Western European countries was an extremely radical social democratic state. Extremely radical. I mean, even the conservative parties were envisioning the socialization of private capital. Yeah, this was for Germany, for France, and for England. I mean, I'm not able to speak about Spain and Italy, but the state was willing to socialize most central industry over 10 years. And it was in a permanent fight with capital to be able to do it. That it failed had then to do with also a change in the public atmosphere. Because the public atmosphere became different and became much more revisionist or conservative than it was directly after the Second World War. So this is only an example to tell you that I don't believe that the state is automatically is an agency functioning in name of this with agreement, but an agency fostering the accumulation of identity. And if that's your question, I would say no.
I think a big part of where I'm coming from is this deep skepticism of the state and of the democratic processes behind it. It was particularly with like examples like the state of Florida, and how we're seeing these kind of behaviors that are very reactionary, and they're based in democratic principles, and they're being exercised through the state. And I think there's a part of me that's not necessarily thinking about the post World War II, but more the post Reagan, Thatcher states and the roles that they've been playing in capitalism and the economies since the 1980s. I think is where I'm coming from.
Isn't the state, I mean, I'm here much more on the side, certain groups a certain subgroup in the Frankfurt School, not the leading, not Adorno, Horkheimer, and probably Benjamin, but Neumann and Kirchner, who understood the state as being the result of a complicated compromise between groups with very different interests in society. It depended a lot on how strong the different groups were able to articulate and defend that. That was responsible for how we compromise it. So the agency of the state is very often not the agency as such. The agency as such we can define. But the direction, the normative orientation, that agency is heavily dependent on what compromise it has to establish among the different industries. That was Neumann taken at the beginning of the we have to say with regard to the present that a certain industry that was much stronger before, namely the work, is in defense heavily, and that obviously capitalists are prevailing. Yeah, also Europe. So, but the state is not better than, let's say, the strength of the industry that there are in the world.
So I actually think that's the perfect place to end, invoking Franz Neumann, who himself came from Frankfurt to Columbia University and became a professor here. And with you, Axel, who came from Frankfurt and became a professor here as well. And referring back, of course, to our Coöperism 713, I think, which was precisely on Neumann's conceptions of the state, and Kirchheimer and Pollock. So I think we're doing a full circle, and I think we're coming back in a nice way to all being here together. So thank you immensely, Axel Honneth, for joining us in the seminar. Thank you, everyone else. Thanks, Katharina Pastor, for joining us as well in the conversation. Special thanks to Kiana for organizing everything, as always, and to Reno for the production of this evening. Thank you all. We'll be getting together one last time on May 1, May Day, for a seminar on cooperative universities, trying to envisage what it would mean to have a fully cooperative university, which seems on a day like today, one of the most important things we should all be thinking about here at our dear university. So join us May 1 right here, and also join us right now, all of you, for a beer at Arts and Crafts across the street. If you'd like to join us, we can continue the conversation.